Welcome to Mystery of the Soul. I'm your co-host, Erin, and I'm joined by my friend Leo, a psychic medium and Reiki master. Our podcast explores the depth of the soul, the spiritual, and the supernatural.
Hello.
Hi, Leo. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
Good. You got your coffee?
I do have my coffee.
Okay, so for our listeners,
but they do not sponsor me.
Okay. It's like 6:30 at night. I just want people listening to know that when I ask Leo about his coffee, he's like an evening coffee drinker, which blows my mind because I cannot have it after 12 p.m. basically. It's no go. But you can have it any time of day, can't you?
Mostly, yeah. I usually have 1 or 2 cups a day, and it doesn't usually affect my sleep.
Unreal. Must be nice to be Leo.
Some
so Leo,
days.
we have we actually have a good topic today, and I'm excited to ask you some questions about your spiritual journey. In particular, are you ready? Can we just dive right in?
Go.
Okay. Yep. Your spiritual journey, let's think about, if we go back to kind of your awakening, so when this began, and as you progressed on your spiritual journey, the question I have for you that I want to talk about in today's episode is, have you ever felt lonely on your spiritual journey? Have you ever felt like what you're experiencing and what you know you can't share or haven't shared or don't have anyone to share it with? And how have you felt? So start from the beginning. When your journey started, were you alone? What did it feel like?
Okay, so I'll answer this in a way. So I don't want to repeat the story that we've already talked about probably in our very first episode. So if people are curious about like how I got started as a psychic medium and how that came about, listen to our intro episode. But there's a couple different ways that I did feel lonely on the journey. One of the ways was when I was first developing as a medium, and while I was developing, I was kind of slowly building trust in the process and in the abilities. And until I felt sure or a little bit more confident about things, I may have been a little reluctant to kind of share what was going on with people. Now, my wife, from the beginning, when things started developing, she was along for the journey. But she went through different stages along my journey as well of acceptance. And she went from the stage of not being too excited about it to tolerate it, and then to acknowledge it, and then to accept it. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like some phases that she went through. The other way that I felt like it's been lonely in a way that, we all have, or hopefully at some point on our spiritual journey, we make some connections with some friends, like-minded people to help support us. And that's a big reason why we want to do this episode tonight. But I've always felt like the black sheep of my family amongst, my parents and my siblings, and I've always felt a little different. And so when these abilities started to come out, it took me a while to kind of share it with like my mom and dad and my brother and sister. I think I shared it with my brother and sister first, because I felt like there would be less judgment about it. And I guess the reason for worrying about judgment like for anybody with feeling judged about something, if you're feeling judged about it, it can kind of chip away at like your self-esteem and your confidence in it. So sometimes you might be a little reluctant to make yourself vulnerable in that way, with taking the risk and being able to kind of sustain whatever reaction comes out of it, because not knowing how someone's going to react. But my sister and brother took it as kind of a matter of fact and like, okay. And my mom was like, okay, so tell me what you do. And I kind of described to her, a lot of us have heard of John Edward and have watched him work years ago when he came out with Crossing Over. And my mom watched him years ago when he was on. And I said, do you remember him? And she's like, yeah. I said, well, what he did, that's what I'm doing. She's like, oh. She's like, so you connect with loved ones in spirit? And like, yeah, that's what I do. And then she asked me a few more questions, like, how does that work? And then my dad, he was more reserved, more quiet about it. I think he believes, but he has, I'll say it's more of a healthy skepticism about him, because he likes hard evidence in something more tangible to believe in something. I think there's still some days that I question, how does he really think about what I do? So some days I feel like, yeah, I think he understands what I do and believes it. And then other times I might, wonder again. But I think for the most part, I think he understands and believes in what I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did you
So
do
those
for
were those. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
What would I do?
What did you do for yourself in those moments as you were like telling your mom and telling your dad and telling your family? Was there anything you did to give yourself comfort or confidence or relax? Because you were basically coming out with like really personal information. Like, what did you do to take care of yourself?
I mean, a few different things that I did as the mediumship was developing. Part of my process was journaling about the readings that I did to help with kind of recognizing and documenting like the validations that were coming through in the readings to kind of help support my confidence in the process, and what was coming through was actually happening and it wasn't being made up in my head, because other people were actually validating and confirming the stuff that was coming through. So it was believable, it was tangible. Back in 2020, one of the things that I did that was really helpful is I actually started listening to spiritual podcasts, kind of like what we're doing. And that kind of helped me plug in and feel plugged into a spiritual community. And they may not have been present with me, but I felt like I was part of something.
Yeah, that's awesome. The journaling is such a good idea. That's a really good idea. I bet a lot of people would find that helpful. Okay, so let's go back to your dad. So you told your dad, you told your wife. How, as your journey progressed, right? And now your family knows and feels grounded. How do you move through your day to day? Do you ever feel lonely? Like you are a practicing psychic medium and Reiki master. Every single day you are in this. Do you still feel lonely? What causes it? And how do you solve for it when you feel it?
I would say I don't feel lonely anymore.
Oh,
And
good.
I think a big part of that is having the confidence in knowing what I do and believing in what I do and believing in the process. I think is kind of like a big backbone of whether I feel supported or not, or whether I need support or I need to rely on someone else's support. But I feel very lucky also that I have made friends over the last few years during this whole process with this growth happening, that I've developed really, I would say, good, solid, quality, deep relationships with like-minded people that, maybe aren't necessarily on the same path as me, but on their own journey. And there's a lot of things that we can kind of share together and connect in a way that we can kind of acknowledge each other and kind of hold space for each other.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you also teach Reiki. You have students of Reiki, and certainly I'm
I
sure you
do.
have clients that come to you, right? So if a
Mhm.
client or a student in either capacity of yours is kind of at a point in their spiritual journey where they're feeling a little lonely, what kind of
Mhm.
advice would you have for them?
A lot of the same advice that I followed myself is what I would give them, as far
Yeah.
as like things are happening along their spiritual journey. And they may not necessarily be developing as a psychic medium, but let's say they're new to energy work and new to Reiki, for example, and they come to me and they experience Reiki for the first time. And then with that experience, it gets them talking about, well, this happened too, and these other things happened. So I'm able to kind of hold space for them, like
Mm-hmm.
physically and emotionally. And the things that I would recommend are the types of things that I kind of did myself, is like journaling about like your experiences. And, their experiences are probably going to be different than what mine were, but they're their experiences. And just kind of documenting, journaling, and having that to kind of fall back on and be able to look back a week, 2 weeks later, 3 months later, 6 months, a year later, and see kind of
Mm-hmm.
where they started and see how far they've come, see how they've grown. And then also just doing things to kind of plug in with other things they're curious about in either metaphysical or spirituality ideas or arenas. So, going to like sound baths or drum
Yeah.
circles, or going to a crystal shop, starting to get interested in crystals, looking at oracle cards, all kinds of different things to kind of experiment, like what you're drawn to and just to, what's going to kind of help sustain. It's almost like when we get on this path, we almost develop a hunger or a thirst for it. And
Yeah.
so, what's going to satiate that?
Yeah. Yep. Totally.
Does that make sense?
It does. You know, yoga is something to consider as well. Like that's been something for me because I'll go to
Mm-hmm.
yoga class and it's not overtly a spiritual endeavor, right? But at least in my yoga class,
Right.
they openly talk about the chakras and breath work and energy. And a lot of that is the foundation to spirituality, right? So I find that in that
Mm-hmm.
community, I at least find a connection to some of the basics. And it's nice, you know. Um, Sound baths too are on my list. I want to go to my first sound bath. Totally want to do that. Um,
I think you're going to
Abby,
enjoy that.
yeah, I think I would. I'm looking forward to it. Abby couldn't make tonight, and she's not been feeling well for the past couple of weeks. But I remember when she first told me about her psychic mediumship, and we talked about this in the first episode, didn't we?
We did.
I think, yeah. Okay. Um, but I it was just so obvious to me that this would be like a natural extension of her life experience, that like it was like her telling me that the sky is blue. Like it was so normal. I don't even remember questioning it. I was totally like, yep, okay, sure, that makes sense. I think she questions herself a lot more than I ever questioned her. And I think if she were here tonight listening to us, she didn't do pretty sure she didn't do any journaling, right? She didn't have anyone until she met you, Leo, as her mentor to help her fine tune this craft or really focus on this gift. So she was just figuring it out in an essence in a very lonely way, because she had me, and she obviously had who she knew she was connecting with, but she didn't have an expert or anyone else around her who could guide her through the process till she found you. So, reaching out into you, and that probably felt pretty lonely for a while. But to mitigate that, right, she found you. She reached out. We got her a mentor. So for anyone who's feeling lonely, use your community to lean into that a little bit.
I have a question for you, Erin. So on the topic of like what you just talked about with Abby telling you for the first time, and you said you kind of accepted it just as it was, right? But can you think back, was there any experiences in your life or cumulative experiences that you've had that kind of got you to the place mentally, emotionally, that you could just take Abby for her word and accept something like that?
That's a good question. We've never talked about this before, so I'm going to give you an answer.
I know.
This is a good question because we've never talked about this.
Yeah, I
know. It was about 10 years ago when my first dog, Abner, died. And he was the love of my life. He was the moodiest, grumpiest, most loyal schnauzer you could ever have. And I loved that dog with my whole heart. And he had oral melanoma, which is a cancer in the mouth. And we actually I had surgery done. Took him to an expert veterinarian. We had surgery done to remove the melanoma. They actually removed part of his jaw with it. It was a significant surgery. He recovered. It gave him an extra year or two of his life. And then he passed in May 2014. And the grief was overwhelming. It was crushing. And I have so much empathy for when people lose a pet, because as a society, we don't recognize how painful it is, or we don't recognize that kind of love for a pet is so meaningful. But I digress. What happened was a couple of months after he died, I was at the barn and I overheard someone else talking about animal communication, and that you could find someone who communicates with animal, living or dead. And I remember being like, oh gosh, that's interesting. And I sat on it. And then I finally asked them who they used as an animal communicator, and they gave me the name. And at the time I was living in New York City, and this barn was in New York City. And this person that I asked didn't know me particularly well. It was just informal. Anyway, the point is, I reached out to this animal communicator who lived in Kentucky, and all I did was give her a photo of Abner, and we set up a phone appointment. And at the time, my social media was locked down, so it was set only to private. And so the point is, this woman probably, it would have been very difficult for her to figure out my life story. Well, she connects with Abner, and she immediately starts talking about pain in his mouth. And she starts talking about an upset stomach, which he had as an adverse side effect of the pain meds that he was on. And then she started talking about how he had difficulty walking and what was happening, all of this was true. And he was having difficulty walking. Unfortunately, the tumor shortly before he passed had pushed back against his brain and was causing nerve damage down his spine. So he was having difficulty walking. And this specifics that she offered about his life were so detailed and spot on. And I remember at the conclusion of that conversation crying, and then realizing that it probably was a very real thing. And I told people about that experience. I was not ashamed. I told coworkers, I told friends, and I remember some people looked at me like I was crazy. And I remember thinking, we've just hit the jackpot. We've just realized that like life exists after death, and it doesn't limit grief. It didn't solve my grief, right? It just showed me a little bit more magic in this world that I didn't see that existed, and I latched onto it.
Mm,
So that was the experience.
that's a great experience. And so that happened. Did that happen then before
Yeah.
Abby came out about the psychic mediumship, right?
Long before. And I remember telling
Okay.
her, it's so funny because I haven't thought about this in so long.
Hmm.
Yeah, I told both my sisters about it. I told my parents about it. My mom in particular. Oh, here's a crazy part about the story. So I guess my mom in her head had asked one of our deceased dogs to meet Abner at Rainbow Bridge. She never told me that this was the thing that she had prayed for, but we knew that it was Abner's time, that it was coming, and she had said this prayer and called on um, dogs who had in our family who had already died to meet him. And I never knew that. She never told me this. And then I asked the animal communicator, is he okay? Is he alone? And she started describing who met him on the other side. And I was like, those sound a lot like my family dogs that I had growing up, like to a T. And so I was telling my mom about this story, and I hear my mom on the phone just gasp. She just took this sharp breath because she was putting the pieces together. And she said, Aaron, I prayed that Spencer and Cien would meet Abner on the Rainbow Bridge when you put him down. And that's exactly who met him. And so for both my mother and I, it was a moment where she and I both were like, oh my God, what just happened? And I remember telling
Wow.
Abby, and Abby was equally as moved by the whole experience. There wasn't anyone in my immediate family that was like disagreed with it. I think my dad was probably skeptical, but he didn't outright disagree with it. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that was it. That was pretty moving.
Wow. Yeah, I would say. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So then I get to talk about Abner too. But yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I wonder if for actually, while we're on that topic, for a lot of people, that can kind of be the impetus to awareness, right? Grief opens a lot of doors where you might otherwise be closed to the idea of spirituality, and then grief happens, and you're really forced to reconcile with what spirituality means for you and doesn't mean the same thing it used to.
Right. And it find people find themselves like grabbing at straws of anything.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In search of
Yep.
like something out there.
Yep. 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 So, Leo, if you're another question for you, if you're at like a cocktail party, I don't know if you go to cocktail parties. Let's say you just go to a party. Someone asks you what you do for a living. How do you lean into that? How do you describe that? Do you just go for it? Do you take a soft approach, hard approach? What do you do?
Uh Nowadays I just get right to it. Um,
Yeah.
I just tell them I'm a psychic medium and a Reiki master teacher and I do this and that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it took a while to get to that point. Um, because I've been a licensed massage therapist for years, going on about 18 years. And so, probably 6 7 years ago, I would have led with, oh, I'm a full-time massage therapist and
Mm-hmm.
I'm spiritual. And I might not have had the confidence in kind of just, you know, being confident in saying what I do. But now I have no problem with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of like saying, oh yeah, I live in Massachusetts.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so funny. Have you ever encountered anyone that had like an adverse reaction to that?
So far, no. I would say if someone wasn't interested, they may not dig further or ask more questions. They might just say, oh, okay. And then they might switch topics. And that doesn't bother me. That's fine, because everybody's at their own place for it. And I don't need to push anything on anybody. And I don't need to convince anybody of anything either.
I think you just hit on such a beautiful point about spirituality and loneliness, and sort of when you find someone that doesn't necessarily connect, it's going back to your own belief in your own, what you're exploring for yourself and what you feel is right for yourself will help come back to that when you encounter someone who's not as receptive to you are as you are to that topic, because that's what's gonna to ground you, right? Because if you automatically release your power and start feeling self-conscious about the fact that they're not exploring this topic with you, which I personally have done, I have felt that myself, then you're giving away all the enjoyment and all the belief and all the magic that you've given to your spirituality, right, to this other person. So don't do that. Go back to your own confidence and your own knowing in those kinds of moments. Yeah, it's super
that makes
helpful.
sense. And I think also what I was going to say is, I feel like everybody's has a different risk tolerance, I'll call it, where we find this term with investing or other things. And we have our own risk tolerance in what we're willing to be vulnerable about or share about ourselves. And nobody's risk tolerance is better than the other. It just is what it is. I think it can change, and I think it can change with knowledge and then just new experiences, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense, and it's an awesome way to put it. Risk tolerance, very accessible phrase.
Because it's in a situation like that, it's like testing our comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about risk tolerance, it's like, how far am I willing to go? Or, if I go too far, is the water too hot? Or do you know what I mean? Or too cold or whatever. And so, but you have to stretch yourself, and it's like exercise. You're not going to grow unless you exercise and work on building the muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
So spot on. Yeah, that's so spot on. And you can do it at your own pace, right?
You can.
Yeah.
And there's different ways. Just like with fitness, there's different tools to kind of build your fitness. There's different spiritual tools to kind of, I don't know if I want to call it your spiritual fitness, but your spiritual wellness, or I'm not sure the word I'm looking for, but it's just people can go many different routes to kind of strengthen their belief, their confidence in being on the spiritual path that they're on.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yep. It makes so much sense. I think it would help people too, this idea of loneliness, and I might be the only one on my spiritual path in my community or near me. It gives them a little bit of a plan to think through on how to build out that community and how to rely on themselves in moments when they feel lonely. And that's just a beautiful way to phrase it. your advice. I love it.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'll bring up, and this probably will be a different episode, but probably just learning to listen to your intuition and trust it.
Yep. I can't
But
wait to do that
that'll
episode.
probably be a separate episode.
Yeah, that'll be a good one. That'll be a really good one. Yeah.
Anything else we want to say about this topic, do you think? Or that we're leaving out or we're missing?
I just I had one friend tell me, who's also a psychic medium, who's not my sister, not you.
Mhm.
When Abby and I met with her, this was, I don't know, a year or two ago. And Abby was asking her, like, well, how do I tell people? And her name was Jen. And she was like, well, sometimes you can just say that you work with energy and you can just leave it there. And the people who want to connect and people who pick that up, pick that up. And she's like, and sometimes Reiki is a more accessible way to talk about it, like that energy and reading energy versus going hardcore into like the psychic medium. And
Right,
the point she was
right.
making was there's all different kinds of ways you can lean in and explore spirituality in a conversation. Kind of where I think about starting things is a classic example. If like you walk into a room and the people in the room had just had a fight and it's quiet in the
Mhm.
room. Maybe they're doing the dishes or they're doing something else, but you still pick up on something atypical. Most people have a similar story like that in their life where they've picked up on something. And yes, I'm sure it's visual. I'm sure there's some sort of visual cue. I'm sure there's some sort of physical cue. And then there's an emotional cue, right? And they all come together. But that's reading energy. And everyone has had an experience like that. So you can kind of lean into it a little bit in conversations to see where people are in the horse world, because I have horses, and anyone who works with horses knows that they are, in fact, very connected to the energy that's happening. And that has been proven, right? When you look at horses out in herds in nature, right?
Mhm.
That they alert one another to danger and they feel on that cue. But with horses, I may not come full out and say, like, oh, my sister's a psychic medium, but I will openly talk about how, to another person, how I believe that horses do pick up on energy, right? They can pick up on our moods, they can pick up on our confidence. And that's openly acknowledged in the horse community. Like, we know that that's a thing. So the point I'm making is you don't have to be all or nothing when you meet someone and you're exploring spirituality as a topic. There are ways you can kind of lean softly into it to explore it and engage in it and keep it in your life without going hard and fast with like, oh, I believe in psychic mediums or I believe in life after death, right? You can lean softly into the conversation and see where it gets you.
Yeah, and I think different pieces of that, you can think of it as sort of like certain categories of topics might be at like a beginner level, certain topics might be intermediate, and then certain topics might be advanced. Or you could think of it as like if you're explaining something to somebody, if you were to explain a topic that, let's say, is complicated, but you're trying to explain it to a 5 year old, you're not going to use really big words, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
you're going to whittle it down into something that's digestible for them in on where they're at,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're explaining it to someone in junior high or someone that's graduated high school, they've had a lot of different experiences and learned a lot of different things in education and stuff, and their vocabulary is a lot more than, let's say, that 5 year old. And so you may be able to go at a more intermediate level, but it's not to say that even someone, let's say, that's has their master's degree or PhD is at that advanced level to receive. You still
Mm-hmm.
might need to start them out at the beginner level.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Totally. This is
And
a
that
great
might be
topic.
something, yeah, I was going to say that might be something we could talk about another time too, is maybe we can branch off of this conversation and talk about how do we see, or how would we categorize different metaphysical topics, either beginner, intermediate, or advanced.
Yeah, because it can get way advanced. That's actually a great idea because I have so many questions. Yeah, and I bet our listeners do too. There's totally an entry level, and there's totally a mid level, and there's totally a very, very advanced level.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love it. This was a great topic, Leo, and thank you for suggesting it, because I think there are a lot of people as they kind of go on their spiritual journey or awaken and begin a spiritual journey where it feels really lonely. And it's super important to address that and acknowledge it and talk about how to solve for it and support yourself on it so that you stay on that spiritual journey that's right for you.
Nice.
I love it. All right.
So should we leave people with our Feed the Soul?
Yeah, I was hoping you would. Hit us. What you got?
So what I wanted to do is just invite everybody to go onto our website, mysteryofthesoul.com. And I believe you have it posted on our episodes page, right?
Yeah.
There is a link to a guided meditation that I created called the Sanctuary of Insight. And it's my way of holding space for you to take you to a place to gain some either new insight or perspective, or connect with either your higher self or guides or loved ones in spirit. And just to kind of help you through, like if you're going through a period in your life right now that feels very challenging, or even a period in your life that feels like you don't know what to do next. It's a great tool. It's not a long meditation. It's maybe 25 minutes or less. And I recommend people going through it. And then after you finish it, I recommend you journaling about it, writing about it in a notebook or journal about what you experienced, what you felt, what you saw, what was the new perspective? Was there any messages that you got out of it? And just take that and kind of use it however you will.
I love that. And on our Insta, we can do a story too with a link to the meditation as well. So when this episode goes live, we can update Insta so it's quickly accessible.
Okay.
That's awesome, Leo. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I don't think so. I guess thanks for joining us, and It was fun having this conversation.
It was a great one. All right, we'll catch you all next time. Thanks, guys. Bye, Leo.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Mystery of the Soul. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, topic suggestion, or just want to say hi, we'd love to hear from you. You can visit our website at mysteryofthesoul.com, reach us on Instagram, or email us at mysteryofthesoulpodcast@gmail.com. If you're interested in booking a session with Leo, you can contact us at Mystery of the Soul or visit Leo's website directly at leomediummccarthy.net.